Like my son-in-law leaned across the Thanksgiving table, looked my daughter in the eye, and told her that her opinion on something as simple as where they should spend Christmas was, quote, adorable, but not really your decision to make. And his mother laughed like he had just said the cleverest thing she had ever heard. I set down my fork very carefully. I folded my napkin. I said I needed a moment of air, and I walked to the driveway where I stood in the cold for 4 minutes making a phone call that would take 18 months to complete, but would ultimately cost him everything he thought he had built. But I am getting ahead of myself. These things never start with one moment. They start somewhere quieter, somewhere you almost miss it if you are not paying attention. And I have spent 40 years paying attention. My name is Evelyn Marsh. I am 67 years old. I live in a cream-colored ranch house in Knoxville, Tennessee, 11 minutes from the hospital where I worked for 31 years as a charge nurse in the cardiac intensive care unit. I retired 3 years ago. People who have never worked in cardiac ICU sometimes imagine it as a calm, clinical place. It is not. It is a place where you learn to read the difference between a patient who is stable and a patient who is about to crash, and where those two things can look almost identical from across the room if you do not know what you are looking for. You learn to trust a feeling before you can name it. That skill did not leave me when I retired. My daughter Lynnea was 29 when she married my son-in-law. She was a speech-language pathologist who worked with children who had experienced strokes and traumatic brain injuries. She was the kind of person who celebrated her patients' small victories the way other people celebrate championship games. She kept handwritten notes on every child she worked with. She remembered birthdays. She had a laugh that started in her shoulders before it reached her face. Her father, my husband Gene, used to say that Lynnea could make a waiting room feel like a living room just by walking into it. Gene passed from a heart attack 4 years ago, 62 years old. He was mowing the back lawn on a Saturday morning when it happened. I was 20 feet away pulling weeds from the garden bed, and I did not know until I heard the mower go quiet, in a way that mowers do not go quiet on their own. The grief that followed was unlike anything I had experienced in 31 years of watching people lose people. It is different when it is yours. Lynnea took it hard in a way she tried not to show me, because she was always trying to protect me. She started volunteering more, filling the hours, keeping herself occupied with purpose. That is where she met my son-in-law. His name was Derek Colton. He was a project manager for a commercial real estate firm. He coached youth basketball on weekends at the YMCA, and he had the kind of handshake that men give when they want you to know they have thought about their handshake. The first time I met him, he pulled out my chair at the restaurant and called me Miss Evelyn and asked about Jean without prompting, because Lynnea had told him, and he said, "I've heard so much about your husband. He sounds like he was a remarkable man." He said it looking me in the eye. I told myself I was being won over too easily. Old nurse habit, always looking for the chart behind the smile. His mother was named Connie Colton. She was 61, twice divorced, and had lived 40 minutes outside Knoxville in a house Derek paid the mortgage on. She was a small woman who dressed like she was always on her way to a church event she cared about being seen at. She had a way of delivering criticisms inside the structure of concern. She would tilt her head and touch your arm and say something like, "I just worry because I care, you know," and then say the thing she had already decided to say. She moved herself into Derek and Lynnea's life the way water moves into a crack, slowly, and then all at once. The wedding was in June. Small ceremony, backyard of a rented farmhouse outside the city. Lynnea wore a dress she had found at a consignment shop and altered herself. She carried wildflowers. It was exactly what she wanted, and Derek agreed to all of it. Later I would understand that agreeing costs nothing before the ceremony. The costs come after. The first year looked fine from a distance. They bought a house in Powell, a suburb north of the city. Derek handled the finances because he said he had more experience with budgets and investment tracking. Lynnea said that was fair. She was not wrong to think so at the time. Derek set up their joint account, linked their salaries, managed their savings plan. He made a spreadsheet. He showed it to her once. After that, he was the one who checked it. Connie visited every other weekend. At first, Lynnea told me these visits were nice. Derek was clearly close with his mother, and Lynnea respected that. But by month 8, Lynnea had stopped hosting her Thursday book club at the house. Derek likes quiet evenings, she said. It's just easier. She stopped driving up to see me on Sunday afternoons the way she used to. We have things on Sunday mornings now, she said. Connie likes to do brunch. She stopped wearing the dangling silver earrings she had worn since college. Derek thinks they look a little much for a woman my age, she said, and she laughed a little when she said it, as if that were an acceptable sentence for a grown woman to repeat about her own jewelry. I noted all of these things. I did not say anything yet. I had seen enough in my nursing career to know that naming a thing too soon, with the wrong person at the wrong moment, sometimes makes the thing harder to escape rather than easier. I came by unannounced one Saturday morning in March. Lynnea answered the door in a long-sleeved shirt. It was warm enough that I had left my jacket in the car. She said she had been cold all week, probably coming down with something. We sat in the kitchen and I noticed that the coffee she poured for herself, she asked Derek's permission for, not in words, just in a glance she sent across the room before she opened the cabinet. He was on the phone. He nodded without looking at her. She poured herself half a cup. Connie arrived 40 minutes later, unannounced herself, carrying a casserole dish like an offering. She set it on the counter and kissed Derek on the cheek and told Lynnea that she had noticed the baseboards in the living room looked like they hadn't been touched in months. I'm not judging, she said, tilting her head, touching Lynnea's arm. I just know Derek grew up in a very clean house. Derek said nothing. Lynnea said, You're right, I've been meaning to get to those. She said it the way a child says sorry to a teacher. I drove home gripping the wheel. The Thanksgiving dinner was 8 months later. Lynnea and Derek were hosting. She had been cooking for 2 days. The table looked beautiful. She had made Gene's sweet potato recipe, the one he used to make every year, and she told me that she had practiced it 3 times to get it right because it mattered to her. It mattered to me too. I cried a little in the kitchen when she wasn't looking. Connie sat at Derek's right. She had brought her own cranberry sauce, which she announced without apology. The conversation over dinner turned to Christmas, and Lynnea mentioned carefully, with that measured tone she had developed, that she had been hoping we could spend Christmas Eve at my house that year, since it had been 2 years since Lynnea had been there for the holiday. She did not demand it. She floated it like a suggestion. Derek set down his fork and turned to her with a patient expression. Baby, we talked about this, he said, though I had been visiting every Sunday for months and had never heard them discuss it. My family does Christmas Eve together. You knew that going in. I know, Lynnea said. I just thought since last year we... I think your mum understands, Connie said, cutting across her gently. Holidays in a marriage are about compromise. You'll figure out your priorities as you grow. She smiled at me as she said it. Then Derek turned to Lynnea and said almost softly, like he was explaining something to someone who needed it, explained slowly, Your opinion on this is adorable, Lynnea, but honestly, it's not really your decision to make. Connie laughed. It was a short laugh, the kind that tells you the laugh was ready before the joke was delivered. Lynnea looked at her plate. She had put her hands in her lap. Her shoulders had dropped in a way I recognized from patients who are preparing themselves for something rather than reacting to something. This was not a new feeling for her. She had been preparing for this feeling for a long time. I excused myself for some air. In the driveway, I called my former colleague and closest friend, a woman named Sandra Pruitt, who had spent her nursing career in the psychiatric unit and had since become a domestic violence crisis counselor in Knox County. I told her what I had just witnessed, not just the dinner, the glances, the earrings, the baseboards, the half cup of coffee, the long-sleeved shirt in March. Sandra did not pause before she answered. She said, Write it down, all of it. Dates, exact words, do it tonight before you sleep. Then she said, And Evelyn, don't let them see you worry. People like this need you to be emotional. Don't give it to them. I went back inside and finished dinner. I complimented the cranberry sauce. I thanked Derek for hosting. I told Connie her blouse was a lovely color. I hugged my daughter goodbye at the door and I held her an extra second, and she held on an extra second after that. That extra second was a whole conversation. I started a notebook that night, a small brown one I bought at Walgreens that I kept in my purse beside my reading glasses. I wrote in it after every visit, every phone call, every detail. Lynnea let slip without knowing she was letting it slip. The allowance was the first concrete detail that clarified everything. I found out about it 6 weeks after Thanksgiving when Lynnea and I went to lunch at a diner near her office. When the bill came, she opened her wallet and looked at me with the smallest expression of embarrassment and said she had forgotten her debit card. She said it was at home in her other purse. The third time this happened, I asked her directly. We were in my car outside the diner. She looked at the windshield and said that Derek managed their account directly and that he gave her a set amount each week for personal expenses. She said $300. She said it like the number was reasonable. She was a licensed speech-language pathologist billing at $90 an hour in private sessions. Her salary deposited into an account she had no card for, $300 a week in cash, handed to her on Sunday evenings. I wrote it in the notebook. I kept my voice level. I said, "Okay, does that feel like enough?" She said, "Derek is really good at budgeting. He wants to make sure we're saving for the future." I said, "I know he does." Connie's role clarified itself gradually, the way diagnoses sometimes clarify after the initial tests come back. She was not merely a difficult mother-in-law, she was the architecture. She decided which friends were appropriate company for Lynnea. She told Lynnea that a woman named Bria, Lynnea's closest friend since their first year of graduate school, was a little too much, too loud, too opinionated, not the right energy for where Derek and Lynnea were in their lives. Lynnea stopped seeing Bria regularly. Bria told me later that she had texted Lynnea 11 times over 4 months and received brief, careful replies that did not sound like the person she had known for 9 years. The detail that ended my ability to stay quiet came on a Sunday in April. I arrived early for brunch and found Lynnea in the upstairs bathroom. The door was open. She was standing at the mirror in a way that was too careful to be casual. She had a small palette of concealer and a makeup brush, and she was covering something on her upper arm above where a short sleeve would end. I stood in the doorway. She saw me in the mirror. She did not reach for her sleeve right away. She just looked at me for a moment, and her face did something complicated, something that was not surprise. "I walked into the corner of the dresser," she said. My daughter had been a competitive volleyball player through high school and college. She had the spatial awareness and body control of someone who had spent years reading the position of 9 other people simultaneously in a small court. She did not walk into corners of furniture. I said, "Does that happen often?" She said, "You know how clumsy I've gotten." I said, "I know how clumsy you've never been." She looked back at the mirror and kept blending. I did not cry in the house. I went home and I sat in Jean's old armchair in the living room and I cried until I was empty. And then I thought about what he would have done and what I needed to do instead. Because Jean would have driven to Powell and broken the door down, and that would have ended with Lynnea defending Derek and losing another exit. Rage without a plan is just more noise for her to manage. I needed a plan that would hold up. I called Sandra Pruitt. Sandra connected me with the domestic violence advocacy organization in Knoxville that work with survivors of coercive control. The advocate I worked with, a woman named Terry, had spent 16 years helping women plan safe exits from situations far more dangerous than this one. She told me something I wrote in the notebook. She said, "The moment she decides to leave is the most dangerous moment, not before, not after. That exact moment. He will escalate when he feels it happening. You have to be ready before she is." I started building quietly. Terry helped me understand what we would need. I consulted an attorney in Nashville who specialized in divorce cases involving financial abuse. I connected with a forensic accountant who could trace what had happened to Lynnea's salary. I kept visiting, kept writing, kept being the kind of visitor Derek and Connie had decided I was: fond, harmless, a little sentimental. I let them think so completely. The call that changed everything came on a Wednesday evening in October, 13 months after I had started the notebook. An unknown number. A woman's voice, shaking but steady, like someone who had rehearsed composure many times. She said her name was April. She said she had been married to Derek 7 years ago. She said she had found my number through a mutual connection she would not name. She said she had known about Lynnea for 2 years and had been waiting for a moment when it seemed like someone else was also paying attention. She spoke for 53 minutes. She told me she had married Derek when she was 25 and that Connie had arrived within 8 months of the wedding. She described the same progression I had been watching: the social calendar shrinking, the finances centralizing, the criticism delivered through concern. She described losing her own career. She had been an elementary school art teacher before Derek suggested she was too tired from working to be fully present at home. She stopped teaching. After that, she had no salary, no card, no access, and no vocabulary yet for what was happening to her. She said Connie had taught her how to cover the bruises. She said exactly which area. She said Connie had called it practical and said every long marriage had difficult seasons. She said that when she finally told her own mother what was happening, Derek and Connie had gotten ahead of the story and told both families that April had been struggling with her mental health, that her account of events was a symptom of instability rather than a record of reality. Her own aunt had called her to ask if she needed help finding a therapist. She had kept everything: 6 years of text messages, photographs with timestamps, medical records from a clinic 2 towns away where she had gone under the pretense of a routine checkup, a voice recording she had made of Connie coaching Derek on exactly what language to use during their divorce mediation to make April sound volatile. She said she had kept all of it in a fireproof box in her mother's hall closet because she always believed the moment would come. She said, "I didn't know when, I just knew it wasn't over." I sat very still in Jean's armchair and I listened. When she finished, I said, "April, I need you to know something. My daughter is still in that house, and I need to ask whether you would be willing to help her get out." She said, "That is why I called." When I told Lynnea, I did not walk in with April's evidence spread across the table. I drove to her office on the Tuesday afternoon, a time when Derek was at a project site and Connie was at a hair appointment, a detail I had tracked carefully. I sat across from my daughter in the small waiting area outside her office, and I held her hands, and I told her there was a woman named April who had been where she was standing. I told her about the bruises. I did not say above the arm. I let her respond to what I said. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she covered them the same way. Her voice was almost without intonation, the voice of someone confirming something they already knew. I said, "Yes." She sat with that for 30 seconds. Then she said, "Connie showed me. She said it was just something wives learned. She said it with such flatness that it took me a moment to absorb it." She did not cry at the office. She held on. On the drive to my house, she cried the way I have only seen twice in 31 years of nursing, not crying about a specific thing, but crying about a length of time, an accumulated weight, a period of life finally being allowed to be what it actually was. She cried for 40 minutes, and I drove and I said nothing except, occasionally, that I was there. At my house, she slept in her childhood bedroom. The next 6 weeks were the most careful work I have ever done. Sandra connected us to the full advocacy network. Terry worked with Lynnea directly. The attorney in Nashville filed the protective order before the divorce petition. The forensic accountant spent 3 weeks tracing what had been redirected from Lynnea's salary over 14 months. More than $60,000 had moved into a savings account registered under Connie's address with Derek as sole signatory. Lynnea's name appeared nowhere on it. April agreed to testify. On a Wednesday morning, when Derek was at a conference in Atlanta and Connie was at her house 40 minutes away, Lynnea went back to Powell with Sandra and 2 other advocates and took what was hers. By the time Derek landed and drove home, the protective order was in effect and his key no longer worked. His response followed exactly the pattern Sandra had predicted to me 13 months before. First, the voicemails, close to 40 over 72 hours, starting with love and grief and moving slowly into something colder. Then came Connie, calling Lynea's supervisor at the clinic to express concern about Lynea's emotional stability, suggesting that a recent change in her behavior might be affecting her clinical judgment. Then came anonymous reviews posted online for the clinic, worded carefully enough to be ambiguous, plentiful enough to look like a pattern. Everything was documented. The phone records, the voicemails, the IP addresses traced by the investigated Derek had never accounted for. Connie's call to the clinic was recorded by their front desk system. Every review was traced and preserved. April took the stand first. She spoke without performance, without anger, with the steady precision of a woman who had spent years organizing her truth for this exact occasion. She described the progression, the financial isolation, the bruises, the way Connie had functioned, not as a bystander, but as a co-architect, setting up the conditions, coaching the language, managing the consequences when anything threatened to surface. She played the recording of Connie coaching Derek on how to describe April as unstable during their mediation. The courtroom went quiet in the way I have only witnessed in critical care, the silence of people confronting something they cannot metabolize quickly. Lynnea testified next. She was calm in the way she was calm at her patients' bedsides, not because she was not feeling anything, but because she had learned that some things require more steadiness than feeling. She described the allowance, the concealer, the long sleeves in warm weather. She described Connie sitting next to her at the mirror in the Powell house saying that a little concealer was just practical, that every marriage had hard patches, that the women who lasted were the ones who learned not to make private matters public. The judge was not performing patience. She was a woman in her late 50s who had presided over domestic cases for 11 years. She read the financial records like someone who had seen this structure before and was not surprised and was also not forgiving of it. Derek was charged with assault in the second degree and financial abuse of a partner under Tennessee's amended domestic violence statute. Connie was charged as a co-conspirator in the financial fraud. Derek received 3 years. Connie received 18 months and a permanent restraining order from Lynnea and from me. When the verdict came, Connie looked across the courtroom at me. Her expression was not fear. It was the particular disbelief of someone who had always been the one deciding when a story ended and had just discovered that this time the ending had been out of her hands for over a year. I held her gaze. She looked away first. That was 14 months ago. Lynnea lives now in an apartment in the Bedden neighborhood of Knoxville, on the second floor of a building with tall windows. She told me the first thing she did when she moved in was open every window at once and stand in the middle of the living room with the cross breeze going through. She said she just stood there for a while. She went back to work the week after she moved in. Her supervisor had not taken Connie's call seriously. Lynnea's clinical file was clean, and her colleagues had noticed nothing inconsistent. Within 2 months, she was asked to take on a new caseload of children recovering from pediatric stroke. She cried when she told me. The good kind, the kind that means something has been returned. She has started wearing her silver earrings again, the long dangly ones she has had since college. She wore them to dinner last Sunday and touched them once, absently, the way you touch something you forgot you were allowed to have. She is seeing someone, a man named George, who teaches occupational therapy at the university. He is quiet and deliberate, and the kind of person who asks follow-up questions. The first time they disagreed about something, where to go for dinner, something small, he listened to her choice and said, "That actually sounds better than what I was thinking. Let's do that." She told me that evening that it had taken her several seconds to understand that the conversation was just over, that there was no checking, no calibration, no reading of a room. She said it felt strange. It felt like something was missing. Then I understood that what was missing was the fear. I understood that. April and Lynnea are in contact now. They met once at a coffee shop near the clinic, and Lynnea told me they sat for 3 hours and ordered 2 rounds of coffee and only talked about Derek and Connie for about 40 minutes. The rest was about their work and where they had traveled and what they were reading. 2 women who were pulled through the same current, who found each other on the far shore, and who are building entirely separate and solid lives. As for me, I have been writing this in the evenings after dinner at the kitchen table where Jean used to sit with his crossword puzzle. I write it because I spent 40 years learning to trust a feeling before I could name it, and I want every mother and grandmother and sister and friend to know that the feeling is real. The quiet changes, the long sleeves in summer, the glance across the room before she pours her own coffee, the laugh that used to fill a room and now apologizes for itself. You are not being paranoid, you are paying attention. Those are not the same thing. Abuse does not announce itself. It moves in with a casserole dish and calls it love. It teaches her to cover the marks and calls it practical. It takes her salary and calls it budgeting. And it works because it is patient and because it counts on the people who love her to doubt themselves long enough for the system to become permanent. Do not doubt yourself long enough. If there is a woman in your life who has gotten quieter, who is wearing long sleeves when she used to love summer, who asks permission before she answers a direct question, ask her if she is safe. And if she says yes too quickly, sit with her a little longer. Sometimes the second cup of coffee is the one where she finally says the thing she came to say. What part of this story stayed with you, and what city are you listening from? Leave it in the comments. Your voice down there might be the thing that helps someone else find theirs. I think about something Sandra told me early on, when I had just started the Brown Notebook and did not yet know how any of this would end. She said, "People who build systems of control always believe the system is invisible. That's the whole point. The moment someone sees it clearly, it starts to fall." She was right. And what I've come to understand, not as a nurse, not as someone who spent decades reading people in crisis, but as a mother who almost doubted herself long enough for it to matter, is that seeing clearly is not the same as seeing easily. Derek and Connie were not sloppy. They were patient. They worked incrementally, the way erosion works, small and consistent, until one day you look at the riverbank and the shape has changed completely, and you cannot name exactly when it happened. They counted on Lynnea not being able to name it, and for a time, she couldn't. What stopped them was not luck. What stopped them was the accumulation of small, deliberate choices made by people who refused to confuse love with passivity. I chose to keep the notebook instead of keeping the peace. April chose to keep the evidence instead of moving on. Sandra chose a career built on helping women find exits rather than endure interiors. Terry made a plan with us before Lynnea was ready to make one herself. These were all choices rooted in something I have come to think of as moral clarity. Knowing that what is happening is wrong and refusing to negotiate with that knowledge, even when it would be more comfortable to. Linnea's part of it required a different kind of courage, one I could not give her and could not rush. There is a particular kind of strength it takes to name your own experience when someone you trusted has spent years teaching you to distrust your own reading of events. That is not weakness. That is the weight of a system working exactly as it was designed. The strength she showed, sitting across from me in that parking lot, and then in the car, and then in her childhood bedroom, and then on that witness stand, came from somewhere in her that Derek and Connie never reached, no matter how long they tried. Her intelligence was always there. The coercive control dimmed it the way a dimmer switch dims a light. It did not remove the source. What I want anyone listening to take from this is not a checklist. It is a posture. Pay attention with both your instincts and your documentation, because instincts without evidence can be dismissed, and evidence without instinct is never gathered in the first place. Trust the quiet changes. Trust the long sleeves in warm weather. Trust the glance across the room before she pours her own coffee. And when you trust those things, do something deliberate with them. Write it down. Make the call. Sit with her one more hour. The people who tried to erase my daughter believed that silence was something they could manufacture and maintain indefinitely. What they did not account for was April. What they did not account for was Sandra. What they did not account for was a 67-year-old retired cardiac nurse who had spent 3 decades learning the difference between a patient who was stable and a patient who was about to crash, and who was not, under any circumstances, going to mistake one for the other when it was her own daughter in the bed. Lynnea wears her silver earrings now. She opens her windows. She orders her own food and does not look at anyone before she speaks. I watch her do these ordinary things, and I think about how long ordinary took to get back to her, and I think it is worth every page of that brown notebook.